Thank you so much. So I'm briefly going to defend capitalism. We've got 20 minutes. Let's see how that's going to go. It's a big task, but let's remind ourselves of this. In a mood when there's a lot of cynicism around about what business and capitalism is about, let's remind ourselves that the whole thing started with a massive claim about human happiness. The early defenders in the 18th century who spoke up in favor of the system that we call market or consumer capitalism did so on the grounds that this system and this system alone could guarantee the happiness of the greatest number. It was not primarily about greater profitability. That was a secondary consideration. So let's remind ourselves of this. But something's gone a little wrong, both intellectually and practically. Do you remember that advert? It showed a group of friends hanging out, hugging. It was probably Italy on a beautiful summer's evening. And they were drinking, and they were drinking Campari. And the logo behind it said, beneath it said, Campari and Friends. And it's a lovely image of really what might happen if you bought Campari. Which is that your social life would really improve, and finally you would be in a beautiful golden land of friendship, hugging, intimacy, etc. And you know, the amount of people who must have gone out on a rainy Tuesday afternoon and bought crates of Campari, returned it to their flat, drunk it alone in front of the telly, and felt very disappointed. This has given capitalism a very bad name. And we've got other organizations that do this. Do you remember the famous Dove adverts? A lady in the bath, she's looking so peaceful. It's an idyllic scene of lack of agitation and anxiety, and below it says Dove and calm. Again, you get your crate of Dove back home, and you unpack it, and you're lying in your bath. And of course, you're still worrying about your in-laws and your lack of this and your presence of that, and all the rest of things. It hasn't solved it. In the 1960s, advertising discovered that many things could be sold on the back of what they called, in private, psychological pressure points or goods. In other words, you've got a boring car to sell, or a pencil, or some loo detergent, or something like this. And what do? This product is obviously so boring. What you do is you try and ally it to the things that deep down we all really crave: love, friendship, belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, and a lack of agitation. These are the things that really get us shopping and excited. And therefore, what you need to do is you have the promise of calm and friendship and love, and then at the very last moment, in comes the detergent, the bleach, etc. And this is how capitalism has been trundling on for at least the last 50 years. No wonder it has a bad name. I'm very optimistic. So some people say, okay, this means that the best things in life are free, and that we must simply stop consuming, good for the planet anyway, and wind down capitalism. My belief is that capitalism's only just got going. We're still only learning to sell things that are relatively basic in terms of, think of Abraham Maslow's famous pyramid of needs. Starts off at the bottom with needs for transport, shelter, basics of food, as you climb up further, communications, etc. And right at the top, the need for love, belonging, purpose, meaning, connection, etc. Now, if you map the economy onto Maslow's pyramid, you find that most businesses, certainly most of the FTSE 100, is down at the bottom of that pyramid. It's attending to transport, the transportation of lumber, of timber, cement, etc. This is what most of the economy is about. It's my belief that as we go deeper into the 21st century, one of the salvations of capitalism is that we'll learn to buy and sell one another more meaningful things. And as we do so, the levels of meaning associated with work will be transformed. Because at the end of the day, what saps a lot of the meaning of work is the sense that we're buying and selling each other things which are of negligible importance. You see it, you're on the way to the airport or going to have a picnic, etc., and by the side of the road, there's a giant advert for a bar of chocolate. And you think, this thing is taking up so much real estate, so much of my life, and yet it's such a trivial part of any decent kind of existence. So there's a real gap. Back in the 18th century, quick summary of one of the big intellectual debates of the 18th century. Basically, the philosopher David Hume argued that societies become rich the more they buy and sell one another quite silly things. He mentioned plume hats, ice creams just coming in, bows for your shoes, strange things for the house, imitation feathers and birds and all sorts of things. And when people buy and sell each other these things, Hume thought this was a great thing because even though these things were totally silly, and he was a philosopher and thought very sternly about all these things and didn't like them, he knew that societies become rich and therefore you're able to fund your army and your navy and also look after the poorest in society. So capitalism may not be pretty and it may be all about buying and selling nonsense, but that doesn't matter because at least there's money in the exchequer. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau listened to these debates and was appalled. He said, no, we mustn't buy and sell each other nonsense. We must just stop buying and selling things and return to a simple life. So that was his famous phrase about returning to the life of the simple savage. And he believed that all of us needed only one pair of clothes, maybe two if we lived in a very cold climate. But really, we could eat nuts and fish and simple fruits, and we had absolutely no need of fashion and dressing up and all the rest of it. And all of that was nonsense. And therefore, we should return to a simple life. Now, that's a horrible dichotomy. Because the horrible dichotomy is either you have an economy based on buying and selling nonsense, or you have a totally austere North Korean-style economy where there is no luxury, no discretionary expenditure, and business is suppressed. I believe that we are going to learn to buy and sell things that are more meaningful. And there's hope on the horizon. I'm hopeful about Facebook. Now, Facebook's got lots of problems, etc., but it is the first over $1 billion company that's dealing with something that's right on the top of Maslow's pyramid of needs, and that is friendship. It's actually selling friendship. Now, it may not be exactly right, and there are all sorts of corruptions, blah, 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 but you see my point. Through technology and other mechanisms, there is no reason why we wouldn't learn to make an economy that does genuinely satisfy the things. Rather than selling Campari, let's sell the friendship. If the friendship is the thing that's actually driving people, rather than selling soap via the image of calm, let's go and sell calm. A company like Headspace is doing very well, just taken on their 300th employee, I heard. In other words, there are companies now, and there is a future in which many of the things that are currently driving idle consumption will themselves be turned into commodities. And I have no problem with that. I don't believe that the precious things in life are beyond commerce. In fact, when commerce gets to grips with them, it often systematizes them, makes them more widely and more reliably available. When people say things like, a good conversation, that should be free. Well, should it? Maybe you can go somewhere and have a good conversation. Psychoanalysis, the great invention that it would be, you actually pay someone to listen to you. People go, well, what about your friends? And I don't know about your friends, but my friends, I start off and within 5 minutes, they're out the door. They don't want to listen. Much better to pay someone and then they can't leave. Got them for 50 minutes. So I believe that we're going to be able to climb up that pyramid. Many people, when you say to people in businesses, what's the number one problem of employee disengagement? One word keeps coming back, and that word is quite odd because it's so heavy and deep. They'll say, the job doesn't have meaning for people. People are leaving because we can't provide enough meaning. Now, what on earth is that word, meaning? I think the word meaning, though a bit sort of spiritual, is really quite simple. I think a sense of meaning comes from a feeling that you are, through your labor, helping someone else, either by reducing their suffering or increasing their pleasure. And a job becomes meaningful if you have a tangible sense of that, and also if the job is plugged into something deep and sincere inside you. We're often presented with the idea that we're all selfish people. I don't think we are. I think that there is no greater satisfaction than to serve. And people go, oh, I don't want to be a servant. Yes, you do. We all want to be. There's nothing nicer than to be a servant. Children know it when they make their parents' cup of tea in the morning, and they just like the idea of being the servant. We somehow, because of an unfortunate history of servitude as defined in a certain narrow way, we've got the feeling that to serve is not noble. It is. It taps into something very deep in us. Part of the problem of industrialized societies is that all of us tend to work in very large systems. If you want to make one generalization about industry and commerce in the UK, it's big. Most employees, over 70% of employees, work in organizations of 50 or more people. So in other words, most people work in big systems. And wheel back 200 years, that was absolutely not the case. We used to work in small systems. Now, what's the difference? What does that have to do with meaning? Well, the thing is that most organizations do have meaning. They do help people. But most people working in those businesses can't feel that help is actually being delivered because of scale and specialization. Modern industry relies on scale and specialization, and this is fantastic for the bottom line and disastrous for centers of meaning. Because if you are one of 20,000 people working on a project which will be finished by 2019, and it's taking place in 4 continents, and it moves inch by inch every day, you can't have a sense that your life is meaningful because you lose the thread. You know, Aristotle, back in ancient Greece, defined the ideal tragedy as something that had to unfold in a relatively short space of time. The average Greek tragedy takes about 3.5 hours, and there's real reasons for that. The action is compressed. Why? It's the same reason why football matches only last 90 minutes. If something lasts too long, if it's got too many players, think about football. If modern business was like a football game, it would be like a game that's played by about 20,000 people on a pitch. It's got maybe 19 balls. It takes place over years. There's bits everywhere. A lot of the action you can't see. Some players are behind the screen. No wonder we get bored and confused and think, as we're standing on our little narrow patch of the football field, I'm not seeing the ball. I don't know what's going on. What we need above all is a thread connecting our position with the position of others. There's a lot that's been told about storytelling in businesses, and a lot of it's very specious. But at its most basic, we are very bad often at holding on to the narrative that we have about what we're doing in a situation. And that can be rather strange because we think, well, surely we know what we're doing. But no, sometimes, on a fairly regular basis, there's something in our brains that sort of wipes clean what it is, that longer narrative. And we have to start back to basics and go, okay, who am I? Where did I go to school? What's the point of my life? Who's this person next to me? Oh, yeah, my spouse. My children. Okay, so, and this is often seen as a crisis. It's not really a crisis. It's a necessary part of stock taking and reorienting one's story. And companies need to do this as much as individuals because the people within companies are constantly forgetting what the whole thing is about. There is meaning, but it gets lost. Look, in a way, my theme is to think about psychology within modern capitalism and business. And there's a very pessimistic view of how much psychology you can sell people in the marketplace, but there's also a real pessimism about how much psychology can exist within organizations. Now, I'm slightly preaching to the converted, and thank God you're all here, but there is still an unbelievable amount of suspicion within UK businesses about how much psychology is allowed, is warranted, and contributes to the bottom line. I mean, we have these arguments all the time. It continues. And the reason partly is that we are an instinct-driven society in 2 key areas, love and work. Let me put a bit of flesh on the bones of that. In most areas, we are systematic. We believe in training. We believe in taking people aside and rigorously instructing them in the art of doing something. And we think that really works. Let me start with love. If you do that in love, people get very suspicious. If you say to somebody, look, don't just go to a nightclub, hang out, or switch on Tinder and think you're going to have a happy love. You need to be systematically trained in love. You need to understand your psychology, what happened to you as a child, who you're most suited to, how you're dangerous to be around, because all of us are dangerous to be around, how you're a liability. And this training will take, at least 42 hours. Most people will go, what? No, I'll just wheel back on Tinder. No, we need training. We are the unfortunate heirs of a very dumb romantic philosophy which makes us believe that the most sincere and deep things should come spontaneously without training. We believe this in love, and oddly, we still believe this in work. So people will go, what do you feel like doing after you finish university? Oh, I don't know what I feel like doing. Maybe. So most of us are assumed that we'll have that special feeling. Oh, brain surgery, accountancy. And then we will naturally go off to these places. Right? Then there are the lost ones among us. I was one of them. Sure, some of you were among them. And then you get taken to that unfortunate character called the career counselor. I've spoken about this person before. There are limitations. But generally, the limitation tends to be that the whole thing's supposed to be over in 40 minutes with a test on a computer. And that's human beings are sadly, very complicated machines. We can't unlock them in 40 minutes with a computer. So we need to go a little bit deeper, but there's very little patience for this. Then we enter work. So we're probably, most of us, in the wrong job, I should say. Most of us, what is on our card is not what is on our hearts. And the agony of that normally strikes us at 5 p.m. on a Sunday evening as we survey the gap between our hopes and our realities, and we realize the gap is very strong. Please listen. There's a little alarm bell that rings at that point, and that little alarm bell is going, don't let me die without having done something that I really want to do and need to do. And most of us squash that. We turn on the telly, the Antique Roadshow, etc. But we shouldn't. We shouldn't, because it's really not nice to put aside, to let this precious person inside us die. All of us have a real self that we're generally not really giving time for. But anyway, we normally end up then in the wrong job, and in the wrong job it gets worse because, the hidden truth that HR never quite admits to is that all of us are crazy. We are all crazy. The only people you can think of as normal are people you don't know very well. And so sometimes you say to your partner, you say things like, well, you're really a bit strange and eccentric. My friend Bill's totally normal. My friend, that's because you don't know your friend Bill. You need to know someone. So, and sometimes, children will say, oh, my parents are so mad. No, they're not mad. Everyone's mad. It's just that you know your parents from close up and you don't know anyone else from close up. This happens also, of course, in the workplace, because though we believe that the workplace is an area of professionalism, and professionalism basically means I vow not to go mad in front of you. But the problem is that the problem is that we can't help ourselves. So we put on our CVs that we're trained in this and trained in that and done a bit of that. But what we don't add, of course, because we want the job, what we don't add is I'm slightly difficult in this area, my mother never did this, my father is like that, da-da-da. And of course, if we knew this, I mean, when you've got 10 people sitting around a boardroom table, you don't just have 10 people, you have at least 10 family homes, you have 20 parents, spouses also in the room because they're guiding, and their mothers and their fathers, and when we're talking to anyone, we're not just talking to them, we're talking to lots of figures that are sort of superimposed upon them. We're carrying a lot of our history, and this is what makes us so strange and prickly and hard to deal with. One of the trickiest things to deal with is people pleasers. In organizations, there's always a people pleaser, and they're very nice, and they always agree with everything you say, and they're very, very friendly, and you think you've really got an ideal person on your team until you find them weeping in the loo or reporting you to someone else because they had a huge objection that they never said, and etc., and it becomes a nightmare. So people-pleasing is rife around UK businesses. It's one of the key things that what one has to deal with. That has a history, right? If you're a very small child and you've got a father who every time you say something slightly unpleasant shouts, or a mother who's slightly depressed, and every time you bring something slightly unwelcome to the table, she goes, that's it, I'm killing myself, you are going to become a people-pleaser. And unfortunately, there are many, many such people in the world. In order to run a non-people-pleasing organization, you need to understand that there are such phenomena around. You need to create an environment in which bringing bad news is seen as a really great thing rather than a problem, and that you need to make sure that you don't press the buttons of these very fragile people who will be people-pleasing in the area. So, look, I think one of the most important things you can do when dealing with an organization is to have as a baseline the sense that everybody is fragile, everybody's very strange, and everything needs to get a little heavier than we might like to be. The enemy in this is cheerfulness, or its more aggressive cousin, cheeriness, and cheeriness is the good mood that will tolerate no other. And we sometimes impose our cheeriness, and a lot of office life is cheery. And we have to be aware of that. And if I was running a large business, I would put above the door, we are all very fragile and we are all slightly mad. So as we walk through the door, we acknowledge this, and that makes it a much more useful backdrop against which to try and do business. There is still an awful lot of what I call office Victorianism, a sense that we are Livingston reaching the upper Nile as we go to the office. Our psychology is so immensely complicated, we shouldn't see this as an enemy of good business. We should see this as an opportunity to harness our strangeness, our neuroses, the depths of our passions and strange compulsions, to use and channel and recognize these as things that can be part of business life rather than shunted to one side. So, ladies and gentlemen, I recommend to you the concept of a more psychologically aware kind of capitalism, both as producers, consumers, and also as employers and employees. Thank you very much.